There was a monstrous cover-up of everything. I know it, and so do the people who covered it up.
It angers me terribly that we don't know the truth. And the arrogance of those in power that continue the cover-up and the lie is beyond tolerance.
We're not a free country anymore because the people who are smart enough and powerful enough to take out a president like that and get away with it for 25 years are probably involved in other areas of the government. In other words, the country is being run by people we did not vote for.
If it could be done to John F. Kennedy in 1963, it could be done to another president in the future. And we can't afford to have coups d'etats in America, no matter how cleverly orchestrated and sinisterly contrived they may be. That cannot be permitted to happen. And the way in which you prevent that from happening is to expose those elements of government and society in this country that were responsible for the killing of John F. Kennedy.
The southeast corner window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, Dallas. According to the official verdict, the spot where a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, fired 3 shots into Dealey Plaza, striking the president from behind as he rode in a motorcade down the center of Elm Street. And each year on November the 22nd, an informal gathering on the grassy knoll of people skeptical of their government's conclusion.
And in honor of the events that took place here in November 1963. One moment, please.
Until now, the world has been asked to accept the Warren Commission's verdict on the death of John F. Kennedy. New evidence that exposes the complex and sinister forces that brutally murdered the President of the United States 25 years ago will be shown here for the first time. President Kennedy's last day began at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in Fort Worth. In his entourage were Vice President Lyndon Johnson and the Governor of Texas, John Connally.
Basically, his purpose for his visit to Texas, it was not just to Dallas, was to raise money for himself and for the Democratic Party, and also to enhance his standing, because he was looking forward to the election in 1964.
Couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
I'll put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
His second engagement of the day was a luncheon in Dallas, a 6-minute flight away on Air Force One.
And now the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace both now and forever. Amen.
From the dark, overcast, the drizzling rain of Fort Worth to the bright sunshine when we landed at Love Field in Dallas, it promised to be an absolutely spectacular day for the president, for the vice president, for me. I was governor of the state. Ms. Connally and I rode in the car with the president and Mrs. Kennedy. He got a very, very warm reception. Schools had turned out. The school children were lining the street by the thousands. They were applauding, and it was a very happy, joyful occasion, really.
2 cars back from the presidential limousine was Senator Ralph Yarborough with Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson.
As we approached the city and then finally turned down Main Street toward the Trinity River, the crowd increased as we got to the heart of Dallas. And it's one of the most enthusiastic crowds I saw in any city we were in Texas on that tour. That's on the sidewalks. Now, if you looked up in the upper stories, I never saw a single smile at any window I looked at. Some looked down and looked like with dislike on the faces.
Nellie turned to the president and said, Mr. President, you can't say now that they don't love you here in Dallas. And within a matter of a few seconds after that, we turned on Elm Street to go down to get on the Stemmons Freeway to go out to the Trade Mart where the luncheon was being held. And that's when the shots occurred. I heard what I thought was a rifle shot. I immediately reacted by turning to look over my right shoulder because that's where the sound came from. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary and was in the process of turning to look over my left shoulder when I felt a blow in the middle of my back, as if someone had hit me with a doubled up fist, about like that. The blow was of such force that it bent me over, and I immediately saw that I was covered with blood. And I knew I'd been hit. And I said, oh my God, they're gonna kill us all. And I heard another shot that was a loud shot almost like that. And immediately I saw blood and brain tissue all over the back of the limousine. I knew then that the president had been fatally hit, because Ms. Kennedy then, I heard her say, my God, I've got his brains in my hand.
The Secret Service in the car in front of us kind of casually looked around, looked up at the back of them, and rather slow to react. And we went under the underpass, and as we came up on the other side, I could see then the president's car, and there was Hill, whom I knew as a Secret Service man assigned to protect Mrs. Kennedy. He was lying across the back to hang on with arm over in there so he could hang on at that high speed. His face turned back towards us, just rather than agony, and beating with his hand on there like a terrible thing has happened. I knew then that Kennedy had been shot. And within several minutes, we came to Parkland Hospital, and the Secret Service immediately jumped out the minute Johnson was there. They practically pulled him out and formed a cordon around him, 4 or 5, and one of them said, Mr. President. I knew then Kennedy was dead, and I walked up to the car where Mrs. Kennedy was still there on the back seat, lying there with her head bowed over, covering her husband's head, his blood running down her leg and by on her clothes, and twice saying, they've murdered my husband, they've murdered my husband. It's the most tragic sight of my life.
While the senator wept for his president, inside Parkland Hospital, doctors battled to resuscitate him in Trauma Room 1.
My most vivid impression of the entire agitated scene was that his head had been almost destroyed. The face was intact but very swollen, and it was obvious that he had had a massive wound to his head.
We decided that the president was dead, and Dr. Clark, the chairman of neurosurgery, had come in the meantime, and he had walked up to the head of the patient and looked inside at the wound and shook his head.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
On duty at Parkland throughout these events was Aubrey Wright, an ambulance driver for the O'Neill Funeral Home. He was approached by the Secret Service.
They told us to go into the trauma room and prepare the president to be moved. And had his head wrapped in sheets. I, at the time, didn't know where he had been shot or what, and we was all very sad, everybody's choking back tears. But
Dr. Earl Rose was a forensic pathologist, well trained in medical legal autopsies, and he appeared at Trauma 1 and said, this is a homicide in Dallas County, and I will do the autopsy on President Kennedy. In the meantime, a casket had been acquired, and the president's body had been placed in it, and he was informed by the Secret Service that if he didn't get out of the way, he would be run over by the casket as they were leaving. This was the President of the United States, and they were taking him back to Washington.
There was a lot of cursing going on. I was embarrassed, especially for Miss Kennedy, because she was standing right behind us. The priest was there. A lot of what I thought was too foul of language to be going on. It was a terrifying type thing. It's hard to believe, that grown people could be so childish about things, and everyone trying to take over.
Vice President Johnson had already left for the airport, shortly to be followed by Jackie Kennedy with her husband's body. The casket was manhandled up the steps of Air Force One. Minutes later, Johnson was sworn in as the new president. Barely 3 hours after arriving in Dallas, the plane left for Washington. In Dealey Plaza, in the chaos immediately after the shooting, there'd been confusion about where the shots had come from. Over 50 known eyewitnesses believed that there was a gunman up on the grassy knoll, but the police quickly focused their attention on the book depository. The police were in the building within 90 seconds. In the southeast corner of the 6th floor, 3 spent cartridges were found lying closely together against the wall, near a half-open window that overlooked the motorcade route. Later, a rifle was found on the same floor by Deputy Sheriff Eugene Boone.
In the far corner of the stairwell, you could not see this corner of the building at all from the stairwell. That's where I found the rifle, over in the northwest corner of the building. There were 2 rows of books. The outside row was 2 cases high, and as I looked in the crevice, I saw the rifle in there.
It was an Italian Manica Caccano of World War II vintage, worn and rusty and with a misaligned scope. Despite intense efforts over a 3-day period, the Dallas police and the FBI were only able to find Oswald's smudged palm print on the rifle after his death.
Between Marsalis and Buckley, it's a police officer. Somebody shot him. There's been a police car.
45 minutes after the assassination, a police patrolman, J.D. Tippett, was shot dead in the Oak Cliff area of Dallas, 3 miles from downtown. Squad cars swiftly converged on the Texas Theater, a mile from the scene of the shooting. A man, behaving suspiciously, had slipped inside without paying and disappeared into the upper balcony. One of the first police officers on the scene was Paul Bentley.
I came down from the balcony and entered the theater from this door right here. Oswald was sitting in this chair, and just as I entered, he jumped up as McDonald came up in front of him, Officer McDonald. He immediately pulled a gun from his waist. As I saw him pull the pistol, I dove over the seats and struggled, came down on the side of Oswald, or the suspect. Struggling with him, I scraped his forehead with the bottom of this ring. I had some of the skin from his forehead under the ring when I got to the city hall.
I didn't shoot him because at that time other officers had converged, and I was afraid if I did miss, I might hit another officer. And it seemed like 100 years before I could get that gun out of his hand and get it into my belt. And then after I got the pistol away from him, I let my pistol go back into the holster, and then I popped him one upside of his head. The way he acted, you'd think he'd merely been arrested for perhaps a traffic ticket, because he never had the usual symptoms of nervousness like breaking out in a sweat or shaking or anything like that. He was just a real cool individual. And you'd never think just by looking at him that he was the one that was going to be accused of killing the president and Officer Tippett.
Oswald, the enigmatic ex-Marine who briefly defected to Russia and was working at the book depository on the day of the assassination, claimed he was in the second-floor lunchroom at the time of the shooting. The first to interrogate him was Gus Rose.
I looked up and I saw some officers bringing a man in who was handcuffed. And when I asked them what they had, one of the officers told me that they had the man here who had killed Officer Tippett. And I took the handcuffs off of Oswald and asked him who he was. He refused to tell me, so I searched him. And in his pocket he had a wallet, and in the wallet was 2 pieces of identification. One card said Lee Oswald, the other said Alex Hydell. When I asked him who that was, or which one of these he was, why, he became belligerent and something to the effect he said, "You're the cop, you figure it out."
Oswald, did you shoot the president?
I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for.
You have a lawyer?
No, sir, I don't.
The gun was fired one time by the suspect, but luckily it missed me.
Fought with us like a wild man, and
is there any doubt in your mind, Chief, that Oswald is the man who killed the president?
I think this is the man that killed the president.
From the moment of his arrest, Oswald was presumed guilty and portrayed to the world as a lone nut assassin. But he vehemently protested his innocence at every opportunity.
Well, what this situation is about, nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request for someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Did you kill the president?
No, I have not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, man,
Visibly shaken by this news, Oswald was to be interrogated for a further 36 hours
A policeman hit me.
before his transfer to the county jail.
You regard the county jail as a more secure place to house the prisoner. Is that why you're transferring him from the city jail?
It's customary after a man is filed on that he be transferred. We only keep him in our jail until he is filed on. Necessary precautions will be taken, of course, but I don't think that the people will try to take the prisoner away from us.
On the Sunday morning, Oswald was escorted through the basement of police headquarters by detectives Jim Lavelle and L.C. Graves.
Jim Lavelle and myself and Oswald stepped off the elevator, walked a few steps, and waited till we got the all-clear signal to go on out to where the car was supposed to be parked, waiting for us.
But the car was not in place. Consequently, when I walked out, I was looking to my right where the car was being backed into position, but it wasn't where it ought to be. I could see this crowd of people to my left, which include police officers and news reporters, cameramen, and so forth. I saw Ruby in this crowd to my left. He was standing on the front with a pistol in his hand down at his side.
I caught him out of the corner of my eye, and then I started, of course, getting loose from Oswald where I could grab the gun. But before I could grab the gun, he had already gotten one shot off, so I grabbed his wrist and the gun simultaneously and just spun around with him.
There is Lee.
He's been shot. Shot rang up. Mass confusion.
Had I not got that gun, he may, in the excitement, shot off some more rounds because he was still squeezing on that trigger in the attempt to shoot that pistol again. I think Oswald really died just a short distance from the hospital because he stretched out, every muscle in him tight, and he just said, and then went totally limp. And as far as I know, he didn't make any move or sound after that.
Mr. Oswald died at 1:07 our time in the operating room of the gunshot wound which he had received.
By the Monday evening, both Oswald and Kennedy had been buried, and the inquests begun. All investigations focused on the lone gunman theory, and within 2 weeks, a detailed FBI report declared the guilt of Lee Harvey Oswald. Secret Service reenactments supported their conclusions. In March the following year, sentence was passed on Jack Ruby.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death.
Meanwhile, the Warren Commission, charged by President Johnson to find the truth, operated almost entirely in secret. Based in Washington, the commissioners finally came to Dallas. Their spokesman was former CIA Director Allen Dulles.
Are you convinced that he was shot from the school book depository?
Well, I think we better leave all that, you know. The evidence report will cover all of that, and we'll get into that. But that question might lead to a lot more. And
Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, also came with Commissioner Gerald Ford, a future president. The prime purpose of their visit was to interview Jack Ruby, who had appealed against his sentence. A frightened man, he claimed he could not talk freely in Dallas and begged 8 times to be taken to Washington to testify. The commissioners left, ignoring his pleas.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Are these people in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
The Warren report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed President Kennedy. Incarcerated in his cell overlooking Dealey Plaza for another 2.5 years, Jack Ruby suddenly contracted cancer and died at Parkland Hospital. With his silence permanently guaranteed, Ruby's body was flown to Chicago, the place of his birth, for burial. Only now, a quarter of a century after the president's death in Dallas, is the appalling truth behind his assassination and its cover-up revealed. Secretary Marilyn Sitzman, on the morning of the assassination, joined her boss, Abraham Zapruder, an enthusiastic home movie maker, on the grassy knoll. His film of the passing motorcade was to become the most detailed and gruesome record of the president's death.
We were looking around to see where would be a good place to be. And he looked here and he said, well, this standing up here would be a good shot. But he said, I got vertigo and I can't stand up there by myself. Would you stand behind me and hold on to me? I said, sure, why not? So he gets up here, I get up behind him, and I'm holding on to him. And he started filming about, just before they came around the corner. And we're filming, they come around the corner and start coming down, and they're, you know, waving at everybody. And then we heard what to me sounded like 2 firecrackers. You know, it was starting to get a little confusing because you could see things happening in the car, and you didn't quite get what was happening until they got right here in front of us in the 3rd shot, hit Mr. Kennedy right in his head. We knew what happened.
This harrowing footage, after examination by the FBI, was immediately purchased by the publisher's Time Life and locked away from public scrutiny. Were it not for photo analyst Robert Groden, who gained access to the original and worked on it secretly, its real significance may have remained hidden forever.
We had been told that the president had been shot from behind, from the Texas School Book Depository. If that had happened, he would have been thrown forward, the transfer of momentum of the bullet striking him in the rear of the head. But what we saw was the exact opposite. When he was struck, he was thrown to the rear and to the left, indicating a shot from the grassy knoll. The knowledge that we had been lied to scared me. Yeah, I felt if anybody knew what I knew, that I'd be in a great deal of danger. So I didn't tell anybody. I quietly worked on the film for years. The more evidence that I was able to develop in the film, for instance, the timing of the shots, when the first shot was fired, which was a lot earlier than the Warren Commission had told us, at a point when Oswald, had he been up in that window, could not have fired the shot, until the most frightening, horrifying physical aspects, the nature of the wounds to the president's head, which are visible in some frames after the headshot, much clearer than anything the public has ever been allowed to see. Living with that became a horror. Trying to keep that, afraid of being discovered that I knew that, that's what frightened me the most.
The Warren Commission ignored the film evidence of a shot from the front. They were also selective in their choice of eyewitness testimony. 2 members of the Willis family told them of hearing shots fired from behind the president's car. However, other vital evidence they tried to offer went unrecorded.
The implication was persuading, yes, ma'am, because all they wanted to know was 3 shots that probably came from the depository building, which I never have doubted. That's about all they wanted to hear. That about all got into the Warren Commission, really, that I heard 3 loud shots from a Texas depository.
The headshot seemed to come from the right front. It seemed to strike him here, and his head went back, and all of the brain matter went out the back of the head. It was like a red halo, a red circle with bright matter in the middle of it. It just went like that. It was a terrible time. You cannot imagine seeing this. You knew it happened, but you didn't want to believe it.
The particular headshot must have come from another direction besides behind him, because the back of his head blew off, and it doesn't make sense to be hit from the rear and still have your face intact. So he must have been hit from another position, possibly, in the front or over to the side. I really don't know where. But the back of his head blew off.
So I am very dead certain at least 1 shot, include the one that took the president's skull off, had to come from the right front. And I'll stand by that to my death, over my mother's grave.
The doctors at Parkland Hospital who tended the president minutes after the assassination also saw a head wound compatible with a shot from the front.
I can see that he had a large, about 7-centimeter opening in the right occipital-parietal area. A considerable portion of the brain was missing there, and the occipital cortex, the back portion of the brain, was lying down near the opening of the wound, and blood was trickling out.
Almost a fifth, or perhaps even a quarter, of the right back part of the head in this area here had been blasted out, along with probably most of the brain tissue in that area.
The President's body was flown in Air Force One directly from Dallas to Washington. Accompanied by Jackie Kennedy, the ornamental bronze casket was unloaded at Andrews Air Force Base, apparently to be driven straight to the Naval Medical Center at Bethesda for the official autopsy. It was here that Commanders Humes and Boswell, with Colonel Fink, were making their preparations for the autopsy of the century. Assisting them was medical technician Paul O'Connor.
The morgue door burst open and 6 or 7 men came carrying this casket in and set it on the floor next to the table, autopsy table. As I remember, this casket was a type of casket that was a cheap shipping type of casket. What I mean by shipping casket is that it's not a very ornamental casket. It's not very expensive. It's a very plain casket.
This is not the casket in which Al Reich placed the president's body at Parkland Hospital, Dallas.
It was a expensive bronze-colored type. It was a bronze casket. One of the most expensive that we had in stock. It was a white satin lining inside the casket. We wrapped him in one of the sheets and just placed him in the casket that way.
The casket was opened, and inside was a slate gray rubber body bag with a zipper that ran from the head all the way down to the toes. It's the kind of body bag that you find people that were carried out of a disaster in. We unzipped the body bag, and inside was the body of the president. We put the body on the table. He was nude, no clothes on, but he had a white sheet, bloody white sheet wrapped around his face and his head.
So between Parkland Hospital in Dallas and the autopsy in Washington, the president's body had mysteriously been placed in another casket and also wrapped differently. Since the autopsy, there's also been a major discrepancy in the description of the president's fatal head wound.
It would be a jagged wound that involved the half of the right side of the back of the head. My initial impression was that it probably was an exit wound, so it was a very large wound.
This is not what the official autopsy photographs show. Hidden away for a quarter of a century and shown here for the first time, they reveal the back of the head intact.
The autopsy photographs show a massive wound, but it's in the right temporal area and into the parietal area, which is behind it, between the two. It is inconceivable to me that every single one of the witnesses who saw the president's head could be wrong, and specifically wrong, about this particular wound. They describe an avulsed, exploded open wound in the rear of the head. In the autopsy photographs, you see a small, neat wound of entrance. It's obvious to me that those photographs have been faked.
When I first saw the pictures of the president's body, so-called wounds, what really struck me was, especially the head wound, they showed a nice little neat round bullet hole in the back of his head. When actually what I saw was the whole side of his head blown off. It was gone. I don't know where those things came from, but they're totally wrong. Every one of them.
In 1964, the Warren Commission dealt with this evidence by not looking at it. It was made available to them. They felt if they looked at it, they would have to deal with it and publish it. So they didn't deal with it. In 1977, around that time frame, the House Assassinations Committee had the photographs. What they did with it was even less excusable. They had the photographs, they had the questions that were brought to them about the photographs, and they did not allow the Dallas doctors, the most important witnesses in this particular area of the evidence, to even view them. And the reason seems quite clear. If they have the best eyewitnesses looking at the photographs saying that's not the condition of the president's head, then you not only have a conspiracy to kill the president, but absolute proof of the conspiracy to cover it up after the fact, because the only people who had the photographs were the government. If somebody faked those photographs, it was someone within the government, someone who had access to those photographs.
But there are further disturbing indications of manipulation of the medical evidence in the hours prior to the autopsy at Bethesda. Dallas doctor Robert McClelland.
I would estimate that about 20% to 25% of the entire brain was missing.
My job in working with autopsies was to remove the brain. What struck me was when we removed the sheet, I looked down and I said, my God, he didn't have any brains left, literally. I was just astounded by it. I think everybody else was too, because there was just a gasp throughout the room. There was no brain to be removed at all.
At any normal autopsy involving such gunshot wounds, the brain would have been sectioned and the bullet tracks traced and all bullet fragments examined. This was not done. A vehement critic of the government's handling of the medical evidence is also one of the world's leading forensic pathologists, Dr. Cyril Wecht.
If the brain was not sectioned, then there could be no visualization of its interior. It's as if it never existed. I am very, very suspicious, and I do think that it could have been the height of a sinister conspiratorial activity in the post-assassination cover-up, in this case, to make sure that the brain was not examined in order to be able to disprove, or at least to be able to withhold the attempts by other people, me and other critics, to prove that there was a second gunman firing from the right side. Because again, you see, that gets to the question of whether or not there was a conspiracy.
Another long-standing critic of the official version of events has pursued the truth through the Freedom of Information Act, acquiring valuable documents which he believes prove a cover-up at the highest level. Former Senate investigator Harold Weisberg.
Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby on Sunday, the 24th of November. Nicholas Katzenbach was the acting attorney general and the deputy attorney general, and he knew immediately that Oswald wasn't going to be tried. They didn't have to put this evidence into court. So he takes a lawyer's yellow legal pad, and he writes out in longhand a memorandum to Bill Moyers, that was the channel to Lyndon Johnson, and in essence he says, we got to convince the world that Oswald was a lone assassin and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted if he'd gone to trial. This is before they collected any evidence. This was Monday morning, Monday after the assassination.
The Dallas police were still collecting evidence and had to be stopped. After Oswald's death, the FBI swiftly requisitioned all the physical evidence, much to the chagrin of Police Chief Jesse Curry.
I had a request, and I have it here, where Mr. Wade requested, said, I request that you turn all of the evidence obtained in the investigation of Lee Oswald's assassination of the president over to the FBI for mailing to Washington. We're turning all of our physical evidence over to the FBI.
This was on the direct orders of the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover.
Here you have the greatest police agency in the world. They're supposed to keep the president alive. He's killed in broad daylight on the streets of a modern American city. How can Hoover possibly admit that he couldn't know about this and he couldn't prevent it? There was only one way, by having a nut who was all alone to it. There was nobody to squeal on. So, from the beginning, J. Edgar Hoover had an instant vision. Oswald was a lone nut assassin, and that's all that anybody ever considered, anybody in official position. You can say, let me try and understand what the government did, how it worked this way. And you can understand that maybe for a couple of days, they didn't want the truth to come out because they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't want to frighten people. They wanted to preserve domestic tranquility. Was there going to be an attack on Lyndon Johnson or the Secretary of State? Was there going to be an invasion from abroad? Was this the beginning of a revolution? Those kind of things have to enter the thoughts of the people in authority in Washington. After a couple of days, when everybody knew this wasn't happening, then there's no excuse for the lying.
The lie was that Oswald, a poor shot, fired his 3 bullets from the 6th floor window of the book depository in under 7 seconds. No expert marksman has ever achieved this feat. The Warren Commission, basing its findings on the earlier FBI report, at first said 2 bullets had hit Kennedy, 1 in the back, 1 in the head, and 1 bullet had hit Governor Connolly. Their conclusions were thrown into disarray by eyewitness James Tague.
Standing right at the east end of the triple underpass on the sidewalk between Main and Commerce. And when the first shot, which I thought was a firecracker, happened and I heard 2 more, I ducked behind the triple underpass and I actually did not see too much of what was going on until I looked out and the presidential limousine was going right by me under the underpass. At that time, Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters said, "You have blood on your cheek." I reached up, and there was a couple drops of blood. And at that time, I remembered something had stung me during the shooting. He says, "Where were you standing?" We walked back, and from about 40 feet away, we noticed a mark on the curb, a very fresh mark.
The FBI sends some agents from Dallas, and they file a report that says there's no mark there. It must have been eradicated by the brushes using to sweep the streets. You know, there'd be no streets left in the world if that happened, but it was accepted. But this wasn't even in the street, it was on the curbstone. So, of course, they couldn't get away with that. So the commission got after the FBI, and they sent Lyndall Schoenfeld, a photographic expert, down. And accompanied by Robert Gimberling, who was the case agent in Dallas on the assassination, they got the pictures, they spoke to the photographers, they went exactly to where a point was, and there it was. Except that it was a little bit different. Instead of a hole, you can see the difference in color, you can see the difference in texture, and I know because I've examined it at the archives. It's darker and smoother. Instead of a bullet hole or a nick made by a bullet, you've got it all smoothed over in darker color. So they dig it up, they take it back to Washington, they go through this incredible charade of making a scraping samples off and making a spectrographic analysis of what they know is not the evidence. They don't give a damn about the fact that underneath it is something that could have been a consequence if it hadn't been covered over. They have no questions about why would somebody want to hide this when a president is killed. And then they destroyed the spectrographic plate when I asked for it. At least they say they did, and the court said to produce it. They said it doesn't exist. The explanation, not under oath, understand, just a possible explanation. It must have done it to save space. A 32nd of an inch in the world's largest collection of files, which the FBI has. They're saving space with 1/32 of an inch, but they get away with this in court.
They did not want a missed shot. It would not fit. And my testimony would prove that there was one missed shot that went over the limousine and hit the curb beside where I was standing. It did change the outcome of the warrant report.
So late in the day, the commission were left with only 2 bullets to cause all the wounds to both Kennedy and Connolly, and one of those bullets had to have injured both men. To explain this, Arlen Specter, a counselor to the commission, created the single bullet theory, known to critics as the magic bullet.
The infamous magic bullet. We have that bullet exiting from President Kennedy's neck, moving forward and leftward and downward. It now stops in midair, it turns to the right, it comes back a full 18 inches, stops again, and then slams into John Connolly's back. It continues downward, and it goes through his wrist, and somehow they get that right wrist over to the left thigh. If you look at the Zapruder film, you'll see in the individual frames that John Connolly's right wrist is not near John Connolly's left thigh. The significance of this, the importance, cannot be exaggerated. It is impossible to overstate it. Why? Because the single bullet theory is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report. It's not a matter of how much weight and credibility do you give to it. It's a matter of whether or not you have a single bullet theory that permits you to conclude that there was only one person firing, whether it was Oswald or anybody else in the world. If you don't have a single bullet theory, then you cannot have a sole assassin. And if you move to that point, then you're into conspiracy by definition. And that's why it had to stop with Oswald as a sole assassin. And that's why they came up with a single bullet theory. There's no question in my mind that that 26-volume set should be taken from the shelves of all the libraries where they now rest in the United States from nonfiction and placed in the fiction shelves along with Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and Gulliver's Travels. That's where they belong.
Straight out of the realms of cheap fiction, Chicago's tough West Side and the birthplace of a notorious son. Jack Ruby, small-time hoodlum and runner for Al Capone in the 30s, based his life around gambling, narcotics, and prostitution. His Carousel Club in Dallas was one in a long line of unsuccessful nightclubs, where Ruby often played host to members of the Dallas police force and the criminal underworld. A fitness freak, Ruby swam in this pool at his apartment every morning, but internally, his life was in chaos. In the months preceding the assassination, his phone calls from the Carousel Club and this apartment to well-connected mob figures increased 10- and 20-fold. a pattern which had begun with the announcement in late April of President Kennedy's intended visit to Dallas. A distinguished journalist who knew Ruby well was Seth Cantor.
In the weeks immediately before the assassination of the president, unaccountably, Ruby had visits from some members of the underworld who he had not even seen in a period of something like 20 years. In May of 1963, Ruby traveled to New Orleans to negotiate for one or more strippers for his club and dealt with a man named Harold Tenenbaum there. But New Orleans was and has continued to be controlled by a very powerful mafia figure named Carlos Marcello.
Marcello, a leading target of the Kennedy brothers' war on crime, had sworn vengeance against them. His interests in Bourbon Street were first visited by Ruby in June 1963, ostensibly to recruit fresh flesh for his Carousel Club. This dancer at the show bar, known as Jada, was signed up by Ruby. But was she the cover for more serious underworld business?
Ruby's connections with nightclub people in New Orleans meant that one way or another he was dealing with Marcello associates. He had telephone contacts and personal contacts with various well-known gunmen and thugs who regularly serviced the underworld in Chicago, Miami, Las Vegas, Houston, and in New Orleans.
These underworld links were never investigated by the Warren Commission, who found no evidence of a conspiracy. They also found no connection between Ruby and Oswald. Interviewed for the first time, former nightclub singer Beverly Oliver has finally broken her silence of 25 years.
I purposely have waited this long. I've always felt very threatened. You know, a lot of folks that gave testimony are no longer around to give testimony any longer. I didn't want to become a statistic. I didn't want to be one of those people that shot myself in the back of the head with a shotgun. One night in particular, I recall about 2 weeks prior to the assassination, being in the club. Parking lot separated his club, the Carousel, and the club that I worked at, the Colony Club. So in between shows, the showgirls from the Colony Club would go over to Jack's Club and watch their show, and in their show breaks, they would come and watch our show. So I had trotted over there that night and was watching the show, and there was a girl that danced there by the name of Jada, and she was sitting at the table with Jack Ruby and another man, and I went and sat down with them to have a drink. As I sat down at the table, Ruby introduced me to the man sitting there at the table with he and Jada, and he said, "Beverly, this is my friend Lee." And after Jack Ruby went into the police station and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, it was then that I realized this was the man that I had met in the club 2 weeks prior to the assassination of Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby were linked together, and I don't know how, and probably I never will. But I know in my heart that man, Lee Harvey Oswald, or the person that was shot in the basement of the police station, was the man that was in the club 2 weeks prior to the assassination. As a matter of fact, the next day, Jada gave an interview to the newspaper, and she said the same thing that I'm saying to you now, that she met Oswald 2 weeks prior to the assassination of Kennedy. However, unfortunate it is, Jada is dead, or so they tell me.
Jack Ruby's close links with the Dallas police gave him easy access to their headquarters. On the assassination weekend, he was seen there several times, even correcting information about Oswald given out at a press conference. Was he stalking his prey? Billy Grammer was a police communications officer on duty the night before Ruby killed Oswald. Around 9 p.m., he received an urgent message from a caller who refused to identify himself.
I thought I recognized the voice, but at the same time, I could not put a face or a name with a voice. And as we talked, he began telling me that we needed to change the plans on moving Oswald from the basement, that he knew of the plans to make the move, and if we did not make a change, the statement he made precisely was, "We are going to kill him."
Billy Grammer reported the call, finished his shift, and went home to bed. He was asleep when Ruby, seen here on the edge of picture in his grey fedora, prepared to move in for the kill.
There is a prisoner. Do you have anything to say to
The first Billy Grammer knew of the slaying was the following morning when he switched on his television set.
No sooner than I turned it on and they were telling that Jack Ruby had killed Oswald, then I suddenly realized, you know, knowing Jack Ruby the way I did, this was the man I was talking to on the phone last night. At that time, I put the voice with the face, and I knew within myself that Jack Ruby is the one that made that call to me the night before. And I think it was obvious because he knew me and I knew him, and he called me by name over the telephone. And seeing this and knowing what I knew and what he had said, then to me it had to be Jack Ruby.
He is shot. He is shot. Oswald. It is Oswald.
While his victim lay dying on the floor of the jail office, Ruby was dragged past him and taken up to Oswald's empty cell, where he was interrogated by Don Archer.
His behavior to begin with, he was very hyper. He was sweating profusely. I could see his heart. Of course, we had stripped him down for security purposes. He asked me for one of my cigarettes, so I gave him a cigarette. Finally, after about 2 hours had elapsed, which put it around 1 p.m., the head of the Secret Service came up, and I conferred with him, and he told me that Oswald had, in effect, died, and it should shock him because it will mean the death penalty. So I returned, I said, Jack, it looks like it's going to be the electric chair for you. Instead of being shocked, he became calm. He quit sweating. His heart slowed down. I asked him if he wanted a cigarette, and he advised me he didn't smoke. And I was just astonished that this was a complete difference in behavior of what I expected. I would say that his life had depended on him getting Oswald.
He made the statement, "We are going to kill him," which leads me to believe that this was not a spontaneous thing that happened on the spur of the moment. He was watching Oswald coming out the door and all of a sudden he decided to shoot him. I do not believe that. I think this was a planned event with him being the man to do the shooting.
I told you earlier this morning, I think it's a waste of time. I have no chance whatsoever.
Startling new evidence of a conspiracy has emerged from a faded Polaroid photograph taken 25 years ago by Dallas housewife Mary Ann Moorman. Facing the grassy knoll, she took her picture of the president within 1/6 of a second of the fatal headshot. Horrified by the experience, Mary Ann was never to use the camera again.
Mine is a Polaroid, and I can only take one every 10 seconds, and it was at that time whenever I took it.
He was shot?
No, I didn't. I must have sensed it immediately when he slumped, because in the picture that's the way she's there, and he slumped over.
From the moment the president was hit until today, the terrible secret within Mary's picture has remained hidden.
To me, it's kind of frightening to think that this could be, and no one has found it or cared to look for it. I'm talking about our federal agencies, that something could have been there all this time and no one cared to do anything about it.
But someone has. We will reveal for the first time the man whose image has come from within this picture and who fired the shot that killed the President of the United States.
That's on the sidewalks. Now, if you looked up in the upper stories, I never saw a single smile in any window I looked at. Some looked down and looked like with dislike on the faces.
Nellie turned to the president and said, Mr. President, you can't say now that they don't love you here in Dallas. And within a matter of a few seconds after that, we turned on Elm Street to go down to get on the Stemmons Freeway to go out to the Trade Mart where the luncheon was being held. And that's when the shots occurred. I heard what I thought was a rifle shot. I immediately reacted by turning to look over my right shoulder because that's where the sound came from. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary and was in the process of turning to look over my left shoulder when I felt a blow in the middle of my back, as if someone had hit me with a doubled up fist, about like that. The blow was of such force that it bent me over, and I immediately saw that I was covered with blood. And I knew I'd been hit. And I said, oh my God, they're gonna kill us all. And I heard another shot that was a loud shot almost like that. And immediately
I saw blood and brain tissue all over the back of the limousine. I knew then that the president had been fatally hit because Ms. Kennedy then, I heard her say, my God, I've got his brains in my hand. The Secret Service in the car in front of us kind of casually looked around, looked up at the back of them and rather slow to react. And we went under the underpass, and as we came up on the other side, I could see then the president's car, and there was Hill, whom I knew as a Secret Service man assigned to protect Mrs. Kennedy. He was lying across the back to hang on with arm over in there so he could hang on at that high speed. His face turned back towards us, just rather than agony, and beating with his hand on there like a terrible thing has happened. I knew then that Kennedy had been shot. And within several minutes, we came to Parkland Hospital, and the Secret Service immediately jumped out the minute Johnson was there. They practically pulled him out and formed a cordon around him, 4 or 5.
Conclusion. Memory and in honor of the events that took place here in November 1963. One moment, please.
Until now, the world has been asked to accept the Warren Commission's verdict on the death of John F. Kennedy. New evidence that exposes the complex and sinister forces that brutally murdered the President of the United States 25 years ago will be shown here for the first time. President Kennedy's last day began at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in Fort Worth. In his entourage were Vice President Lyndon Johnson and the Governor of Texas, John Connally.
Basically, his purpose for his visit to Texas, it was not just to Dallas, was to raise money for himself and for the Democratic Party, and also to enhance his standing, because he was looking forward to the election in 1964.
Couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
There was a monstrous cover-up of everything. I know it, and so do the people who covered it up.
It angers me terribly that we don't know the truth. And the arrogance of those in power that continue the cover-up and the lie is beyond tolerance.
We're not a free country anymore, because the people who are smart enough and powerful enough to take out a president like that and get away with it for 25 years are probably involved in other areas of the government. In other words, the country is being run by people we did not vote for.
If it could be done to John F. Kennedy in 1963, it could be done to another president in the future. And we can't afford to have coups d'etats in America, no matter how cleverly orchestrated and sinisterly contrived they may be. That cannot be permitted to happen. And the way in which you prevent that from happening is to expose those elements of government and society in this country that were responsible for the killing of John F. Kennedy.
The southeast corner window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, Dallas. According to the official verdict, the spot where a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, fired 3 shots into Dealey Plaza, striking the president from behind as he rode in a motorcade down the center of Elm Street. And each year on November the 22nd, an informal gathering on the grassy knoll of people skeptical of their government's...
In the White House on Monday, if you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
His second engagement of the day was a luncheon in Dallas, a 6-minute flight away on Air Force One.
And now the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace both now and forever. Amen.
From the dark, overcast, the drizzling rain of Fort Worth to the bright sunshine when we landed at Love Field in Dallas, it promised to be an absolutely spectacular day for the president, for the vice president, for me. I was governor of the state. Ms. Connally and I rode in the car with the president and Mrs. Kennedy. He got a very, very warm reception. Schools had turned out. The school children were lining the street by the thousands. They were applauding, and it was a very happy, joyful occasion, really.
2 cars back from the presidential limousine was Senator Ralph Yarborough, with Lyndon and Ladybird Johnson.
As we approached the city and then finally turned down Main Street toward the Trinity River, the crowd increased as we got to the heart of Dallas. And it's one of the most enthusiastic crowds I saw in any city we were in Texas on that tour.